Thanks. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, the British are a long ways from out. If they go along with this 2 year process, I doubt they'll ever get out because that's 2 years for Washington to punish Britain economically, and it's 2 years for all the propaganda to be used to beat up the population. They're racist. They've empowered Putin by weakening the EU. They've ruined the economy. So the combination of Washington's economic clout and all of the constant drum of propaganda will probably wear the British down. And of course, this vote is non-binding, and so the Parliament at any time can simply ignore it. You know, democracy is no longer a feature in the Western world. It's not respected. For example, the president of the EU Parliament, Martin Schulz. Now, of course, the EU Parliament is it's not a powerful thing. It's really just a cover for the real rulers, which is the Commission, you know. But they have this sort of parliament to pretend that it's democracy. Well, the president of the EU Parliament said, this is a direct quote, "The British have violated the rules. It is not the EU philosophy that the crowd can decide its fate."
Wow.
In other words, who are you British thinking you can decide? So I don't, I don't expect that Britain will get out. Obama told Cameron before the vote that that Britain wouldn't be allowed out, and Kerry, I think, is over there now, no doubt repeating the message. You have to understand. British people need to understand. In fact, all of Europe needs to understand. The EU is a Washington control mechanism. It was a CIA initiative. The whole prospect of the EU was invented in order that Washington would be able to easily control Europe. To try to control all the separate governments, that's a difficult thing. The governments, some of them are somewhat accountable to people. They have political opponents. To try to hold on to Europe by buying and negotiating with what are now 28 separate governments is a big deal, but it's easy for Washington to control the EU. It's just a few people who make the decisions. And so it's very easy for them to be suborned or bribed or just simply controlled. So it's not a European thing. It's a Washington thing. And it's also important to Washington because of NATO. There's been no reason for NATO since the Soviet collapse. But Washington needs it. It's a cover for Washington's aggression. Without NATO, if Washington went around bombing countries the way it did, people would say, oh, this is a war criminal. The members of the government in Washington would not be able to travel abroad. They'd be arrested and put on trial as war criminals. But because they have NATO, they've got the EU and the European governments, they're all part of this. So it's cover. Oh, this is not a war crime. We're bringing freedom and democracy to people, or we're fighting terrorism, or it's always some kind of a cover. And as long as they have NATO, then this cover works. So what Europe faces and what the British face by being in NATO and being in the EU is that Washington is driving them into conflict with Russia. So the direct consequence of the EU and NATO will be World War III. So the happiest thing about the vote to leave is it may encourage other European countries to take the same vote. And if the EU and NATO unravel, the chances for peace go way up. because Washington loses its control mechanisms. So that is the most important thing about this. Another very important part of it that simply has not been part of the debate, and I was surprised that the City of London and the Bank of England didn't immediately catch on, that the New York banks do not want Britain to exit the EU, because the New York banks want to eliminate London as a financial center, as a competitor. Well, people have forgotten, but the way Britain was enticed into the EU, Britain were told, you can keep your currency, you can keep the British pound, you can have your own money, unlike the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Greeks and the Dutch. Well, that's true. That's how they tricked you in. They got one foot in. But if the vote to leave doesn't get implemented and does not go through and is somehow overturned or simply rejected by the British Parliament, which is certainly possible, then the next pressure will be, well, look, you're part of the EU now. You voted and you changed your mind. You're here with us. And we have a centralized fiscal policy. That means the EU makes your tax and spending decisions and not Parliament. And therefore, you can't have your own money any longer. So it's not going to be possible for the British to be in the EU in the future, in the long run, and keep the pound, because that means they're not in the EU, because the EU is a single political entity with its own currency. And so there's no way you can say, well, I'm in the EU, but I've got my own currency. Jean-Paul Trichet, who was the previous president of the European Central Bank, made this completely clear in his last address. He said, the future for the EU, the next step we take is the centralization of fiscal policies. So, if the Bank of England wants to exist, and if the City of London wants to continue as a financial center, they had better get behind Brexit. They better be supporting leaving, because otherwise there's no longer any role for either, because the European central banks will complete the takeover that is part of the political existence of EU. Now, what will Washington do? Well, it will bribe or threaten the various prominent supporters of Brexit. It will also have the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will have the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, and these are the three largest currencies in the world: the euro, the yen, the dollar. And they will pound the pound. That is, they will short the pound. They will drive it down. You have to remember what one man did to the British pound some years ago. George Soros. George Soros, all by himself, broke the British pound, made billions of dollars. Well, if George Soros can do that, what do you think the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan can do? They can drive it to zero if they want to. They will also, if they wish, short British stocks. They'll drive down the values of British stocks just by selling them short. So there's going to be a lot of punishment meted out to the British for making this vote, because it's not in Washington's interest for Britain to leave. Washington doesn't care a hoot about what's in Britain's interest. It's Washington that counts. We are the indispensable people, the exceptional people, not the British. And so to think that democracy is going to be respected? Of course not. I read you the statement of the President of the European Parliament. There's no respect for your democratic decision making. No American president will have any respect for it. And so the longer it takes England to get out, the less likely it will happen. It's just 2 years is just too long. You'll be punished too severely for 2 years. And people will come to the conclusion that it was a bad decision. So in my view, what should happen is the leaders of this, in fact, Cameron should step down immediately and get out of the way. To stay till October, I mean, there'll be enough punishment by then that the British may change their mind. But what you need to do is to have a new government that says, hey, look, we don't give a hoot about this 2-year business. The British people made a decision. It's now implemented. We're out. It's all over with. There's no negotiation. We're just simply out. Goodbye. And the British should instantly drop the sanctions that the Americans have forced on them against Russia. They should say, yep, no more sanctions. And hook their economy to the rising economies of Russia and China, Iran, India, particularly India, with a long connection, and get part of a different economic mechanism so that they can't be punished, and to take this opportunity to join the rising nations rather than to stay hooked as an American vassal while the American economy and politics collapses. So this is what should be done. There's no time to wait. You've got to get out right away, or you simply won't be permitted to get out.